Okay, welcome everyone. I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to kind of just jump right into everything. So thanks to AJ for moderating today and introducing my talk. So I just want to also acknowledge my co-authors, Jen McDermott, Shira Goldenberg, and my supervisor, Andrea. So I just want to start with sort of additional targeted land acknowledgement as this talk specifically relates to policing and police policy. So I want to acknowledge that our research was collected on the unceded, unsurrendered, and stolen traditional territories of the Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I want to recognize the growing rates of over-surveillance and over-incarceration of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people in Canada. Last year, we saw over 50% of all federally incarcerated women in Canada as of December 21. 50% of Indigenous, 50% of the incarcerated population was women. And this is despite Indigenous women only accounting for 75% of the national population. So I just want to acknowledge that these experiences of incarceration and institutional violence cannot be separated from settler colonialism and the colonial policies that continue to oppress Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. I just want to call attention to some specific MMIW calls for justice, which I would encourage you to read, and think about how we and you and yourselves in your research can potentially address or advocate for these calls in your work, and just some additional readings. Very short presentation. So just going to start with a little bit of background. So women, Two-Spirit, and gender diverse people who use drugs and engage in sex work experience a confluence of negative effects from dual criminalization and stigmatization of both sex work and drug use. And we know from previous literature that there's a significant overlap between both. So there's a well-documented body of public health evidence, epidemiological evidence that has documented the significant harms that come from criminalization and the resulting poor health outcomes of drugs. This includes things like disruptions to harm reduction services, an increased risk of overdose, heightened spread of sexually transmitted and bloodborne illnesses, and a greater risk of sexualized violence. So Vancouver specifically has been the site of orderly, progressive policing and criminal legal reforms related to both the enforcement of sex work and the enforcement of drug use. So we've seen the recent provincial decriminalization of small amounts of specific drugs, but we saw the Vancouver Police Department kind of take a similar approach in 2017 in the wake of the overdose epidemic. We've also seen changes in sex work legislation that has shifted away from criminalizing sex workers and supposedly prioritizes the safety of sex workers, but we continue to see the criminalization of clients. And so with this in mind, in the context of these evolving policing strategies, we sought to examine the lived experiences of women, gender diverse, and Two-Spirit people, to examine how purportedly progressive approaches to policing, sex work, and drug use intersect to shape participant safety and engagement in harm reduction in Vancouver. Just a quick overview of our methods. We conducted 31 semi-structured interviews between 2022 and 2023 as part of a larger community-based study which investigates sex worker safety, health, and human rights in the context of evolving sex work legislation and regional policies. This is AISHA, the qualitative arm of the AISHA study that's based in. So all of our participants in Metro Vancouver had been using some kind of criminalized substance, engaged in sex work of any kind, identified as a woman, cis or trans, Two-Spirit or gender diverse person, and we conducted in-person or virtual interviews and analyzed our data using reflexive thematic analysis with a lens of structural violence and intersectionality. So participants did acknowledge that over the past 5 to 10 years, interactions between police and sex workers have changed, and most participants acknowledge this in a positive way. So they largely noticed that there had been a significant reduction in individual prosecution or arrest and charge of people for selling sex. And this was positively perceived. However, under the legislation, PASEPA, clients are still criminalized for seeking sexual services. And so what our participants highlighted is that even though they, as sex workers, were typically not criminalized, their clients were. And so police were still over surveilling communities where street-based sex workers work in an attempt to prosecute clients or people seeking sexual services. And this was kind of also done under the guise of like protecting sex workers or ensuring that they were safe. But this had pretty significant and real consequences for sex workers, particularly street-based workers, because the kind of continued regular police presence kept clients away out of fear of prosecution. And so this left sex workers out working longer hours and moving more into like dimly lit, secluded areas away from police. And so I have a quote here from one of our participants. When a girl is working on the streets, they, the police, drive by her lot so that customers stay away. Stupid, but they do. That could be their rent, that could be their food, that could be if they're sick, that they need that money. The police are forcing people to be out there longer or in more secluded areas where they're more hidden. So similar to sex work policing, we've also seen policing efforts shift away from the targeting of people for individual drug possession and open drug use. But again, participants did note that they did see a drop in charges for open drug use and the possession of small amounts of drugs, but the sale and distribution of drugs continued to be criminalized. And as a result, kind of similar to what we saw in the context of sex work, police continued to surveil, in particular, overdose prevention sites, looking to catch like in progress drug sales and transactions. And so one of our participants actually worked at an overdose prevention site and said this quote here: the police presence either gets people running into the OPS and not wanting to leave because they know that it's safe there, or they won't come in and they'll use in the back alley instead. And we know that in the context of the toxic drugs supply, this can be particularly dangerous if people are using in the back alley alone. And the other piece that we saw was that the continued targeting of dealers left people kind of without their trusted supply of drugs. And so almost all of our participants noted that they have a regular trusted dealer who they like to go to because they know that they can get more reliable, predictable drugs from this person. They trust them. And so if police are busting dealers, taking their supply, it kind of leaves this vacuum. And people are forced to go to someone that they maybe don't know. And so another participants, I know that my dealer's dose doesn't have benzos in it. And so if I'm in a hurry and the dealer isn't around, I will not buy on the street. I'm scared of getting that benzo dope. I got sexually assaulted about 4 years ago, which was drug related. So this is a big concern for us. We unsurprisingly saw that people who had more intersecting marginalized identities were experiencing more harassment, more violence. Particularly noticed this among Indigenous participants who more often described negative interactions with police, including one participant who had her medicine bag forcibly removed during a physical assault by a Vancouver police officer. And this is a really great quote, one of my favorites from one of our participants that said, I mean, it seems like if the police are just a status structure for a certain kind of person, and any person that deviates from that doesn't get the support that was promised to them. So I think that police just treat people less seriously or cause them harm based on how many degrees of separation they are from straight, white, middle-class men. That's a really perfect quote. And by and large, participants really did not feel comfortable reporting sexualized violence to police in the context of sex work if they encountered a bad date. This was not who they would go to in that case. And there's a quote here: calling the cops is just going to do nothing. The police will take your statement, but they actually don't go out there and look for this person. They never did, and they won't. And they say that they will, but they never do. And then we're just left feeling dirty or burned. So what did participants actually use to make themselves feel safe? We saw that participants largely did not feel like police made them safe. And the services that they actually used to sort of seek safety and find support in were largely well-resourced affordable housing, harm reduction supports and services, trauma-informed healthcare services, and mostly peer community-based support. Quickly, my discussion. So what we really noticed was this parallel piecemeal reform in kind of both the context of sex work and drug use. And this was really continued to negatively affect sex workers who use drugs in Vancouver. So the kind of decriminalization of just one specific aspect of both activities left people still feeling the impact of criminalization. That was my 1-minute warning. I'm just going to go to my policy implications really quickly. So in light of our findings, we really are encouraging the redirections of funds away from police to community sources and supports that address the safety and well-being of sex workers in a meaningful way. We also call for the decriminalization of all aspects of drug work, sex work for all, and the complete decriminalization of all drugs. So I just want to acknowledge all of the amazing investigators, research staff, and community advisors. And, sorry, I went over.